Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Office Hours with Michael Kitces. So I want to talk today a bit about mutual fund share classes. So when I started in the industry about 17 years ago and was studying for my Series 6 and going through all the initial training with the company, I remember feeling a little overwhelmed by all the different mutual fund share classes. There were A shares and B shares and C shares, and they had different compensation and different surrender charges for the client and different costs. And I was struggling to figure out, so when exactly are you supposed to use each one? Like, when do I use an A share instead of a C share? Is there a right client situation for one versus the other? Or is it basically just I choose whichever one based on how I want to get paid? Because if that was the decision, it was actually pretty straightforward. The only thing I recommended was A shares, because I had no clients and I had no revenue and I wanted to qualify my contract and the draw I was receiving. So I figured out how to play the game pretty quickly. You sell the version that lets you stay in the game, which means selling A shares and getting as much of the commission as you could. Now, when I look back, I'm embarrassed, frankly, on those days that to reflect that I was selling whatever could get me the biggest upfront commission. Now, I didn't think of it that way. I wasn't trying to be greedy. I wasn't trying to screw my clients or anything like that. I was genuinely trying to help them. But I joined a firm that said that I needed to meet a certain level of production to keep my job. And the fastest path to making my production requirements was to sell the mutual fund share class that got me there the fastest, which meant A shares where I could hit my targets at 5% for every dollar that I moved. Now, the industry has changed a lot from when I got started. And if anything, I think in some ways it's actually gotten more confusing because the proliferation of share classes has gotten even worse. Now there are more than ever. And so in today's office hours, I want to talk a little bit about mutual fund share classes and also variable annuity share classes, the explosion, proliferation of all the different share classes, and how I think the industry shift to fiduciary is basically going to be Armageddon for most of these share classes. So the starting point is just to look at least the three classic types of mutual fund share classes. So there were A shares that paid an upfront commission to the broker who sold them and came straight out of the fund's NAV with breakpoints for larger dollar amounts. There were B shares, which had the so-called contingent deferred sales charge, or CDSC, which was basically a surrender charge. So paid a similar commission to the broker as an A share, but it didn't come out of the NAV up front. Instead, the fund advanced the commission to the advisor, had an ongoing expense ratio that was higher, and recovered the commission over time. So the broker might be paid 5% up front. The fund charged an extra 1% a year. So after 5 years, it made all its money back. And if the client left within 5 years, there was a surrender charge to recover the unpaid amount. So, broker got paid 5, investor left after 3 years. Investor had to pay a 2% penalty to recover the last 2% that hadn't been paid through the higher expense ratio. And then there were the C shares. No upfront commission to the broker at all. Instead, it simply paid 1% a year, but the expense ratio was typically about 1% higher to compensate for it. And that was the deal. So paid upfront with A shares, paid upfront but no upfront hit with B shares, or just the levelized commission of C shares. Now, in practice, B shares have largely wound down due primarily to a lot of sales abuses. They're still out there, but the problem was because the upfront commission for A shares is reduced for large purchases as you hit breakpoints, but B share commissions were generally fixed. Some unscrupulous brokers sold B shares at higher commissions instead of A shares that would have paid lower commissions with breakpoints. Regulators caught on, and so for what was otherwise the exact same fund, the client just got charged more for no reason. So brokers still have a choice to sell an A share with an upfront or a C share levelized, but B shares have kind of been getting squeezed out in the process. Now, in addition to A, B, and C shares, it's worth knowing that most mutual funds also have some kind of institutional or advisory share class. So these typically have no commission payments at all. They might include just the 25 basis point servicing fee portion of a 12B1 fee, although that itself is optional. So in addition to A, B, and C shares, most companies either call these I-class shares for institutional. American Funds calls them F-class shares. They've got the F1 share class and the F2 share class. The difference between those is whether it has that 25 basis point 12B1 fee that's paid either to the advisor or in some places to the platform that offers it. And frankly, that's how a lot of platforms offer no transaction fee, no load mutual fund purchases, because the platform actually is getting 25 basis points of compensation in the form of the 12B1 fee that the client is paying for. Now, American Funds actually reintroduced recently a new F3 share class as well. Similar to the F2 share class with no 12B1 fee, but it also has no sub-transfer agent fee. So for those who aren't familiar, sub-TA fees are effectively another kind of fee paid by the investors through the mutual fund to the investment platform, technically so that to compensate the platform for all the work it has to do, keeping track of investor purchases and sales, related record keeping, capital gain dividend distributions, all those things that have to be tracked when the investor doesn't actually buy directly from the mutual fund company, they buy through a brokerage platform. So fund companies often would pay sub-TA fees, but the F3 share class, cheapest yet now because it strips out both the 12B1 fees and the sub-TA fees. Now, it's also worth noting, American Fund is kind of a good case in point example because they're advisor sold. They have a lot of these advisor share classes. And in addition to the A, B, and C and F share classes, they also have a 529 version of A, B, and C and F1 share classes. They also have retirement account share classes, R1 through R6, which again, vary in the payments they provide either to the broker selling the funds, the plan to support record keeping, and basically to incentivize their use of the funds. Now, I'm not trying to pick on American funds in particular at all. They're just a good case in point example. Because if you add them all up, A shares, B shares, C shares, F1, F2, F3, the alternative 529 versions of A, B, C, and F1, the R1 through R6 share classes, you end out with about 16 different share classes for the same fund, for the same investment manager, for the same portfolio of securities. The only difference across all 16 is basically the distribution cost, the amount of money that's paid from the fund's assets from the investor, either as a commission or a servicing fee to the broker, or a servicing or transfer agent or record keeping or some similar fee to either the retirement plan or the investment platform that the fund is being sold through or made available on. And now, with the rise of DOL Fiduciary, we're actually seeing the emergence of a 17th share class, the T share. So the T share is like like a hybrid of A shares and C shares. So it'll have a 2.5% upfront commission like an A share, breakpoints for larger purposes, for larger purchases, but a 25 basis point 12B1 fee on an ongoing basis, and then no other revenue sharing deals to reduce some of the conflicts of interest that otherwise might run afoul of DOL Fiduciary. So here's why all this matters. The end result is that we have all these different ways that mutual funds get sold, get distributed to the public. And all the different distribution deals have led to this massive proliferation of mutual fund share classes, because each different share class is basically a different sales distribution deal. That's why we've got A shares with one kind of selling deal and C shares with another, and F1 with another, and F3 with another, and R1 through R6 with another, all the way down the line. But in the end, if we're going to get shifted to a fiduciary duty, the reality is you really only need one share class. Whichever one is the cheapest, not the other 16, just that one. Now, it's worth noting there's a common confusion about the fiduciary rule that it would require advisors to always recommend the one lowest cost investment solution that exists, as though like everyone's just going to be required to use a handful of like Vanguard and BlackRock ETFs for 3 basis points each. But that's actually untrue. There is not a requirement under the fiduciary rule to always find the one lowest cost investment on the planet to the exclusion of all others, nor is there any requirement to use low-cost passive funds in lieu of active ones. That's a myth. But what the rule does require is that for any particular investment you're going to use, you better use the cheapest version of it available. So there's no requirement that you have to use, say, an S&P 500 index fund over a large cap actively managed fund. If you can validate that the active fund provides value to justify its cost, that's fine. However, if you're going to use an S&P 500 index fund, you damn well better use the cheapest one that's out there. Because by definition, all S&P 500 index funds are trying to replicate the same index. So unless there's some underlying fundamental flaw in how the fund is constructed, that means you think it's not going to deliver on providing the S&P 500 index returns, there's really no excuse to take a completely commoditized solution like an S&P 500 index fund and buy anything except the cheapest version of it. And here's the key point. The same thing is true for mutual funds. So in other words, in the context of a company like American Funds, there's no requirement to use an S&P 500 index fund instead of Growth Fund of America, despite the fact that American Funds does cost a little bit more because they have active managers who get paid. However, if you're going to implement Growth Fund of America instead of the S&P 500 Index Fund, there's no fiduciary justification for using a higher commission A-share version of the fund when you could use the T-share version. There's no justification for using the C-share of the fund if you had access to the F-share instead. There's no excuse to use an F1 share with the 12B1 and sub-TA fees if you could have used the F3 share instead. Because, again, by definition, it's the same fund. It's the same manager. It's the same investments. The only functional difference is the distribution cost packed into the fund paid by investors to either the broker or the platform. And as a fiduciary advisor, we will now have an obligation to find the lowest cost version of that solution. So not necessarily the cheapest mutual fund, but the cheapest share class of that mutual fund for the client. Now, I realize that in some cases that can entirely obviate our compensation as an advisor. I mean, if you use the F3 share class instead of the C share, you don't get paid the way that you would for a C share, which simply means the expectation is that you form an advisory relationship with the client, you get paid the advisory fee directly from the client, and then you use the cheapest share class you can to populate the account while you get paid for what you're going to get paid for. So the end result is that the total cost of the client might actually be the same, but now we all use the same F3 share class. No F1 or F2, no C share, no B share, potentially no A share or T share, from half a dozen different share classes down to one. Now, it's also worth noting that this discussion is not exclusive to mutual funds. Variable annuities are also legendary for multiple share classes. Historically, they had a very similar A share upfront, B share surrender charge, C share levelized commission option. Again, even with variable annuities, B shares have been declining a bit with B share mutual funds for some of the same conflicted reasons. But now there are also institutional class variable annuities known as I shares. And then we have a few other alternatives that are unique to variable annuities, including L shares, which have shorter surrender period but higher M&E expense charges to recover the commission paid to the agent. O shares, which don't have an upfront commission, which don't have an upfront commission like A shares, but do have a surrender charge like B shares, usually with declining M&E expenses over time. And then there are X-share variable annuities, which are the so-called bonus annuities. Pays an upfront bonus to the investor, but then have longer surrender charge periods and higher ongoing costs, basically because the annuity carrier has to recover the bonus paid up front because there's no such thing as free money. But here again, all of these differences in variable annuity share classes boils down to how many different ways can we pay the selling broker an upfront or ongoing trail commission, and then adjust all the annuity contract provisions, surrender charges, ongoing expenses, and the rest to make the math work. But in a fiduciary world, you don't need all of those variable annuity share classes. You don't want them. They just bring on conflicts of interest and get you in trouble. And we've seen some of that already. So in recent years, lots of scrutiny on bonus annuities and whether brokers are using the bonus to induce people to swap out of old annuities with surrender charges, buy a new annuity, use the bonus to replace the surrender charge, not recognizing the bonus itself is effectively going to get repaid over time with higher expenses in the new annuity. There's also been a lot of scrutiny on L-share annuities and whether they're also inducing brokers to sell a higher cost product where there's an equivalent one with lower costs that would have fit better for the long-term investor, especially when the annuity is sold with guaranteed income or death benefit riders that by definition would have only been relevant for long-term investors, and the L-share annuity has a higher cost long-term hold. And so in a fiduciary world, all these alternative share classes start to vanish because for a particular investor buying any particular variable annuity, the expectation is that you would sell the one version of the contract that has the lowest cost. And at that point, all the other share classes of the annuity become irrelevant. You can't sell them, or effectively it's an instantaneous fiduciary breach. So because of these dynamics, I think we're about to see just a total collapse in the confusing number of share classes that exist today in the mutual fund and annuity arenas, at least once DOL fiduciary actually goes through. I know it's still up in the air about whether it's just going to get partially delayed, or it looks like even if it does get delayed, it's probably going to be modified or softened a bit, but not necessarily repealed or rescinded. And as long as that core fiduciary requirement remains, which again means every share class besides the cheapest one quickly becomes irrelevant, or a lawsuit waiting to happen if you try to use it anyway. And my guess is that we'll find within just a year or two, mutual funds are probably going to come down to maybe two share classes. T-shares for those that still do some kind of upfront commission business, so they get paid their 2.5% commission. and then some kind of institutional class advisory share. So an iShare or an F3 share in the case of American funds. No commissions, no 12B1 fees, no sub-TA fees, the cheapest version of the raw investment that you can get, and then the advisor layers their costs on top. Because again, if it's meant to be an advisory share class, it's virtually assured to be a fiduciary breach to use a share class with all of those additional costs when there's an alternative that doesn't have them. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean a collapse in advisor compensation, because you can still use advisory accounts with institutional share classes and charge your own advisory fee instead of getting paid, say, 1% through C shares. And at least for some period of time, I suspect we're going to continue to see T shares in place as well. But I think you're going to see A shares quickly vanish in lieu of T shares. I think we'll see C shares quickly vanish in lieu of institutional class shares. Similar scrutiny on retirement share classes, 529 share classes. Variable annuities will probably also come down to a core two alternatives, one with a moderate upfront commission and the other one that's just like a levelized fee-based contract. Now, it's worth noting that the share classes probably aren't going to vanish right away, in part because while DOL Fiduciary is the catalyst that drives this, it still only applies to retirement investors, which means it only applies to retirement accounts. And so you can still use all those other share classes in non-retirement taxable investment accounts, as well as for non-qualified annuities. But frankly, I think it's only a matter of a few years before eventually the SEC acts with its own fiduciary rule, if only to bring parity to the DOL fiduciary rule and get a level playing field. And then the same rules really will apply for retirement and taxable accounts. And there have already been a lot of broker-dealers that have said they're putting their changes in compensation in place uniformly across the whole platform. So the share classes that will be available and the types that they use are going to be the same for both DOL fiduciary retirement accounts and the rest. Because frankly, otherwise, you're kind of begging for a lawsuit against you if a lawyer ever sees that the client's non-retirement accounts have more expensive versions of the exact same fund that you're already using in their retirement account in a lower cost alternative. So frankly, for your own protection, it behooves you to be consistent across the board. Which means I think it's only a matter of time, and it may not even take that much time, to see a total collapse in the huge number of share classes that exist today. So fund companies that have 16 share classes down to probably just 2. A version with some upfront commission for brokers who sell them, like the new mutual fund T shares, and then the lowest cost possible institutional or advisory share class where the advisor would be expected to layer their own advisory fee on top, which effectively will complete our transition from getting paid 1% as levelized commission or distribution charges into getting paid 1% as an advisory fee for advisory services, and complete this transition that we've been going through from brokers who sell products into advisors who sell advice. So I hope that helps us some food for thought about how the proliferation of mutual fund annuity share classes that has been underway for the past decade is probably soon going to go through a very sharp reversal and decline. This is Office Hours with Michael Kitces, 1 p.m. East Coast time on Tuesdays. Thanks for hanging out with us, everyone, and have a great day.